Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio, and today I'm going to be reviewing Moon Adventure from designer Jun Sasaki and publisher Oink Games. In Moon Adventure, you are playing as a crew that has crash landed on the moon, and what you have to do is you have to venture out onto the surface to try to collect undamaged supplies enough to be able to get off the planet. However, you have a limited amount of oxygen and you have magnetic storms that are causing you problems. Well, that's the theme. In essence, this is a cooperative game where you are trying to pool your resources together to successfully complete the mission. Let's head over to the table. I'll show you how it works. Then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts. All right, here we see a starting setup for Moon Adventure, and if you have played Deep Sea Adventure by the same publisher, Oink Games, this is going to look very familiar to you because it is very familiar. It uses a lot of the same kind of ideas from Deep Sea Adventure and changes them to make it a cooperative game now based on the moon. All right, and so the way the game works is as follows. You're going to choose a particular role that's going to have a specific player power. So maybe you'd be the inventor, and if that were the case, you can develop a route for one action point and you can move on a route. You have the mood maker, the veteran, the rookie, the mechanic, the inspector, the athlete, the flight surgeon. Also, you might be the engineer, and if you are the engineer, then what you're going to do is you're going to have this little robot meeple that you place out here too. So let's assume one of these players is the engineer, and now they've got an extra thing that they can do at the beginning of their turn. They can move the robot from 0 to 2 spaces. If you choose to be the carrier, what that's going to mean is at the beginning of the game, you're going to have one extra container card. So let's assume that this player in a 2-player game is the carrier, and so now instead of 5 container cards, they have 6 container cards. All right, so the way the game is going to work, as I mentioned, it is a cooperative game, and what you are trying to do is you are trying to gather these pieces that have scattered across the surface of the moon. And you need to have a number of undamaged supplies equal to a player count. So if you look here, if you can make it all the way back to the base board, and in a 2-player game, if you have 5 or more undamaged supplies, then you have won the game. If you don't have any oxygen cards at the beginning of your turn, then that's a mission failure. All right, so how do you have any idea on how many of these are going to be damaged or undamaged supplies? Well, you have a little bit of help here. You see these three different shapes here. So you've got the triangles, the squares, and the hexes. These, of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, 3 of them are undamaged. Of these, 4 of them are undamaged, and of these, 5 of them are undamaged. So the further away you go from your base there, the more likely you are to find undamaged supplies. But you're not going to know until the end of the game. So what you're going to do on your turn is you're going to choose one of your oxygen tanks. It's either going to have 2 oxygen level, or it's going to have 3 oxygen level. All right? And then you're going to roll that number of dice to get a particular number of action points. So let's say that the engineer here is going to go first. Maybe first what they'll do is they'll move the robot twice because that is their special ability. All right? And they're going to go ahead and spend this 3 oxygen, and they're going to roll these 3 dice. So these are D6s, but they're not exactly standard. They just have 1s, 2s, and 3s on them. All right? So you roll these dice, and this is going to be the number of action points you have to spend this round. So in this case, we've got 6 action points to spend. You've got a little card here that shows you what are the different actions you can do. First, you can move. Each movement, either way, you can go further away from the base or back towards the base, is going to be 1 action point per point of movement. You can activate an OGS, which is an oxygen generation system between your chip and one adjacent to you. All right, so let's say, for example, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to spend 3 movement. Let's say I'm the purple player. 1, I skip that, I jump over that. 2 and 3. So that's 3 out of my 6. I could then, with my next 3, activate or put an OGS spot right there. And if you end your turn on there and your container isn't full, you can draw an oxygen card one at a time as many times as you want. So let's say I had those 6. Let's do this slightly differently. All right. I'm here. I go 1, 2, then I put this 3, 4, 5, and I end on that oxygen generating system. Now what I can do, since that was my 6 points of actions, I could replenish my oxygen. That doesn't cost any action points. If you're on it, you can draw 1 oxygen card at a time as many times as you want. So it started here with all of the oxygen cards that weren't dealt out at the beginning and 1 of these magnetic storm cards in the discard. So you shuffle all of these up. All right. And then you add 1 of these unused, there are 3 more, magnetic storm cards into a discard pile. All right. So now the next time you do this, you shuffle up and draw, you'll have 1 more magnetic storm card in there. So I've got these 5 containers. 2 of them right now are being used up by these oxygen tanks. So if I want to start gathering supplies, I have to make sure I still have room for those. So maybe I'll draw 2 more. 1, and it's 1 at a time, and 2. All right, now I still have 1 spot available. Had I drawn the 1 magnetic storm card that was in there, this would get destroyed and no longer can be of use. So there's a bit of a push your luck mechanic there where you can draw as many as you want, but you're going to potentially break your oxygen generating system. And that's the only way you draw cards, is by ending your turn on one of these tokens that you yourself have to put out. So other actions you can take: you can gather supplies for 3 action points. You can develop a route for 2 action points, which is simply placing 1 of these little markers on there to make it easier to go further for you and also to get back. You basically just jump over those. Now you can't collect the supplies underneath them, so you have to keep that in mind. You can also share oxygen containers for 1 point freely from one player to the next if they are adjacent to you. So that's where you can potentially save a player who's about to lose the game. If they don't have an oxygen, you can give them an oxygen before their turn. You can also abandon supplies by placing them back for 1 oxygen point, or for 1 action point, sorry. So you're going to be going through the game, collecting these supplies, hopefully getting a good number of them, hoping that the supplies you get are enough to be successful on your mission. Let's say I got 1 more of these over here. And if you make it to the bottom, the first person to make it to the bottom can hop in the lunar rover here, all right? But the lunar rover changes things up. If you're in the lunar rover now, for 1 action point, you can move 2 spaces, but you can no longer gather any more supplies, you can no longer develop a route, and you can no longer activate an OGS. So this is just a way, if you've gone all the way further away, for you to get back more quickly to the base. If you can both, well, however many players, if all the players can get back to the base, then you can check to see if you have gathered enough undamaged supplies. So let's say that this was the end of the game. We flip these over. That's good. That's undamaged. Yay! Boo! That's a damaged supply. Boo! Yay! Boo! So this is not good. This is 3 undamaged supplies, and you can check here. You need to have 5 or more in a 2-player game. So this would have been an unsuccessful moon adventure. Basically, that's how the game plays out. Cooperatively trying to gain a number of undamaged supplies, making it back, managing your oxygen. Let's head back over and I'll let you know what I think about it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea on how you play a game of Moon Adventure. As I mentioned briefly in the overview, if you are familiar with Deep Sea Adventure from the same designer and publisher, Oink Games, it's going to look familiar to you because it is certainly a game that is at least a spiritual successor to that game. The big difference is that it changes it from a competitive push your luck game to a cooperative game that has elements of push your luck, but it is less a part of the core experience than it was in Deep Sea Adventure. So let's get right into it. The first thing I want to do is talk about some benchmarks. These are some high-level ideas that I like to discuss when assessing a game. The first thing is the setup and teardown. Now, this is a game that is very quick to set up and tear down, and that's probably not surprising, being that there's a limited number of components. It's a small box game, larger than most Oink games, but still a small box game. Not a lot of components in there. Very quick to set the game up. You can be up and playing in a couple of minutes. No problem there at all. The other thing I like to talk about is rules. And this is something that, for me, for Oink games has been a little bit hit and miss. I felt like some of the rules were a little bit easier for me to grasp than others in their games. Sometimes that could be as a result of maybe even translation issues or just the structure. A lot of times their rule books are structured almost in flowchart manners, and there is an element of that in Moon Adventure as well. However, I felt like this was one of the better examples of rules in an Oink game release. I didn't really have many issues at all. I think there was one question about the setting up of those magnetic storm cards that I was a little bit unclear about, but figured it out. The game is pretty straightforward. It also does a nice job of including player aid cards that help with the rules of the game. So overall, nothing but good things to say about the rules in Moon Adventure. Next thing, art and components. First, a couple of things that maybe didn't work as well, and then what I did appreciate. As far as a potential negative, really the only thing I can think of is that the art is very, very minimalistic in this game. Now, that could be, you could say, well, that's the aesthetic they were going for, and that is the aesthetic in many of the Oink games. It's kind of a minimalistic feel. But I feel like it's especially so in this game. Really, there's almost no art to speak of. You've got your oxygen cards just represent a silhouette of an oxygen tank. Your character cards in this edition of the game don't have any artwork. I know there's a special edition of the game that has artwork that's based off of a pre-existing IP. I'm not really familiar with that. This edition of the game, no artwork for the different characters. So that could be looked at as a negative. It's not the most vibrantly artistic game out there. It's going for a more minimalistic vibe. Now, on the plus side, the components that are there, specifically and especially those wooden components, are lovely. I especially like the robot and the rover kind of wooden meeples. Those are really good. The cardboard components that are there, the supply chits are nice and thick, and the oxygen generating chits are nice and thick. So it feels like a quality production. It does not feel cheap, but again, minimalistic, but what's there is really, really nice. It is larger than, as I mentioned ago, than most of the Oink games, which are usually in these very tiny boxes. This is kind of twice the width of a traditional Oink box, at least the version I got. There is a special edition in a smaller box, but the edition that I got is under twice the size normal. That being said, it's still a very small game in the box. It doesn't take up a huge footprint, and you can kind of adjust how you lay out those supply tiles to, according to the table space you have. This is a game that could be played in a pretty small footprint if you needed to, so that is also a bonus for me. Okay, overall game impressions. Again, a couple of things didn't work as well, and then the things that I liked. The first thing that could be a negative is that this is a game where luck can play a very large role. There's no two ways about it. You could do a little bit of kind of getting the odds by looking at how many of those tokens have undamaged pieces versus not. And of course, it just makes sense that the further away you go, the more risky it is, but the better chance you have of getting undamaged supplies. So you could do a little bit of probability play there, but the bottom line is that, look, you may go all the way to the end and still end up with a couple of damaged supplies. That's just the risk that there is in a game like this. And also, When you are redrawing those oxygen cards, there's a push your luck element. You can draw as many as you want, one at a time. That could be a negative. I actually love that mechanic, but I just wanted to put it out there. If you are luck averse, you may want to keep that in mind. There is push your luck in it, although as I said earlier, I feel like there's less push your luck in Moon Adventure than there was in Deep Sea Adventure. So if you didn't really like that game because you didn't love how much push your luck was in it, you might try this one out. There's less of it there. Now, this game system, for a positive, works very well as a cooperative game. I was very curious if it was going to feel like the cooperative version of Deep Sea Adventure, and then really what's the point? It does and it doesn't. Again, it has enough of the core elements of Deep Sea Adventure that if you liked that game, you could potentially like this game. But I feel like it's really its own game. And so if you don't like Deep Sea Adventure, especially if you didn't like kind of that push and pull of cooperative in a way that you're sharing the oxygen, but competitive in that you're trying to get the most stuff and get back first, this, I think, works very well as a pure cooperative game. It kind of lets you work out that puzzle of using your player powers to their best advantage, managing the oxygen to its best advantage. I think it works very well. I actually think I prefer this to Deep Sea Adventure. I probably want to play it a few more times to make that definitive, but my gut is telling me that I'm probably going to go to this one more than that because I think it works very well as a cooperative game. Another big plus is that I love the player powers. I mean, anytime you can have individual player powers in a game, it usually is going to make the experience better for me, and it certainly does here. That is kind of a standard thing you see in cooperative games, but I do like the player powers. I want to play as all of them, and that's a good sign. The other thing is that I'm a big fan of action point systems in games. It's one of my favorite mechanisms where you have a particular pool of action points and you could do anything you want with that pool. You could take the same action 3, 4, 5 times as long as you have enough action points for it. I've always liked that system, and it's nice to see it brought back here in this game. I mean, it was probably most famous with Kramer and Kiesling with their trilogy of games, Tikal and Mexica. I don't see it used very much, this action point system, and I really like it here. Now, again, going back to that negative of luck, sometimes you're going to roll the dice and they're just not going to work out for you. You spend a 3 oxygen card, which are tougher to get a hold of than the 2 oxygen cards. You roll all 3 dice and they all come up ones, 3 action points. Yeah, that kind of stinks, right? Because you have that swing. It could be anywhere from 3 to 9 action points. You have to be comfortable with that. If you're not comfortable with that, you're probably going to bounce off the game because the dice can just work against you. But for me, I feel like for the length of the time of the game, it works very well. I am a big fan of the action point system here. Overall, this is a game that I feel like is charming. I feel like it does a lot in a very short period of time with a very small amount of components. I'm going to be giving Moon Adventure an 8 out of 10, a high seal of approval. I feel like this is a game that I'm going to come back to, and I look forward to introducing this game to other people too, because I think it has a potentially wide appeal. All right, well, that's it for me. This is Mike DiLisio signing off from Dice Tower headquarters.